Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the Scramble for Africa. I know very few people have even heard of that term. The Scramble for Africa is a term used by historians to describe the carving up of Africa into colonies by European powers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. If you've ever studied World War I, you've probably seen or read that, by the start of the Great War, all of Africa consisted of European colonies except for two countries. The two exceptions were Liberia and Abyssinia. Abyssinia was the old name for Ethiopia. Liberia and Abyssinia were the two countries that were not colonies or controlled by any European country. There were some countries like Egypt and South Africa, which were theoretically independent countries, but were dominated by the British. In 1910, South Africa became a self-governing dominion in the British Empire. This meant that South Africa was like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These countries were essentially independent, but the government in London still had some control. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster was passed by the British Parliament. That law granted the Dominions full legal autonomy, except they still had the same constitutional monarch, the British King or Queen. This meant that South Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were now fully independent countries. Egypt had been part of the Ottoman Empire, but the British military occupied Egypt starting in 1882. The British established a veiled protectorate. Isn't that a great euphemism? This meant that Egypt was not a British colony, but the British were really in control. In 1922, Egypt declared its independence, but the British still kept troops there until 1956. Most people think that the Europeans had been controlling Africa for centuries prior to World War I, but that was not the case. Starting in the late 1400s, with the voyages of the Portuguese around the southern part of Africa, and Columbus unintentionally showing Europeans the existence of two new continents across the Atlantic, European countries created overseas empires. Eventually, the Europeans carved up all of North and South America. And although they had small outposts in Africa, the Europeans did not conquer that enormous continent until the late 1800s. And before we go further, in this episode, we are only discussing colonization. Europeans were certainly exploiting Africa for centuries before the Scramble for Africa. Of course, the most infamous exploitation was the African slave trade, where millions upon millions of people were kidnapped and shipped across the ocean to live the rest of their lives as manual labor slaves. The incredible horrors of the slave trade and the destruction of millions of lives, along with the terrible residual effects which exist today, are not the subject of today's episode. That is a giant topic by itself. Today's episode is limited to the European colonization known as the Scramble for Africa. In the 1490s, Portugal and Spain were the only European countries seriously exploring the world. This brings us to the Treaty of Tordesillas. That was a treaty signed between Portugal and Spain in June 1494, dividing the world into two spheres of influence. The eastern half belonged to Portugal, and the western half belonged to Spain. This was less than 2 years after Columbus's first voyage. And more important, it was more than 23 years before the big event of October 31, 1517, when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the church at Wittenberg, Germany. That meant that the Treaty of Tordesillas occurred before the Protestant Reformation. This was significant because this was still a time when the Pope had great influence over all the kings of Europe. It was the Pope's authority that divided the world in half between the Spanish and the Portuguese. In a conference between the Spanish and Portuguese in the town of Tordesillas, Spain, a straight vertical line was drawn on the map from north to south. All lands discovered east of the line belonged to Portugal, and all lands discovered west of the line belonged to Spain. And yes, I'm putting the word discovered in quotes. Think about how absurd this was. Nobody consulted the other European powers, and more important, nobody consulted the millions of people living in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The north-south line of demarcation was eventually moved and ended up at 46 degrees 37 minutes west of the prime meridian of Greenwich, England, essentially going through modern-day Sao Paulo, Brazil. The Treaty of Tordesillas is the reason why just about all of the countries south of the United States in the Western Hemisphere speak Spanish, except for Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. Eventually, the English, the French, and the Dutch all got into the colonization craze. The Europeans first concentrated on the Western Hemisphere. Why was that? Because it was fairly easy. The Americas were not wide open, empty spaces as the Europeans often portrayed them. There were millions of native peoples throughout the Western Hemisphere when the Europeans arrived. Unfortunately, the vast majority of them were annihilated by germ warfare. This genocide was completely unintentional. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of intentional genocides in the Western Hemisphere, but this germ warfare just happened by accident. There were many European diseases which killed the Native Americans, including measles and influenza, but by far the biggest killer was smallpox. The natives in the Americas had no immunity to these European diseases. And as these poor people died, they could not understand why the Europeans seemed unaffected by these plagues. The Europeans had immunity to these diseases because they had been exposed to diseases such as smallpox growing up in Europe. European diseases eventually killed approximately 90% of the Native Americans throughout the Western Hemisphere. We only have estimates because we do not know how many people were living in the Americas before 1492, but the percentage of dead is somewhere close to 90%. Think about what an insane figure that is. The Black Death swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351. We only have estimates, but it is believed that from 30 to 60% of all Europeans were killed by that plague. It was horrendous and had an enormous effect on human history. But the Black Death wasn't anywhere close to the ravages of European diseases on the Native Americans. After approximately 90% of the people in the Americas had died from European diseases, it was much easier to create colonies when there were only approximately 1/10 of the natives to fight the Europeans. Now let's talk about Africa. It is a huge continent and is much bigger than most people realize. The problem is that so many maps use the Mercator projection. What's that? The name comes from a European cartographer named Gerardus Mercator. Since the Earth is a sphere, it's difficult to depict on a flat map. The Mercator projection of the world shows the entire globe as a flat map, but it is distorted. The Mercator projection is the standard world map that most of us are familiar with. North is at the top, south is at the bottom, east is to the right, and west is to the left. There are plenty of parallel lines going left to right, which represent west to east, as well as lines going from top to bottom, representing north to south. All of those lines going from left to right, meaning west to east, across the map, which appear to be parallel, are actually parallel on the globe. This means that those lines never come together. That is why lines of latitude are called parallels. An example is most of the border between the US and Canada, at least from the west coast to the Great Lakes, runs essentially along the 49th parallel. The problem arises with those north-south lines, which are called meridians or lines of longitude. When you're looking at a globe, all of those north-south lines of longitude come together at the North Pole and the South Pole. But on a Mercator projection map, they appear to be parallel lines which do not come together anyplace. As a result, any land close to the North Pole or South Pole appears much, much larger than it really is, and everything around the equator appears a lot smaller than it actually is. That's why Greenland looks a little larger than Africa on a Mercator projection map, when Africa is actually 14 times larger than Greenland. This distortion is called the Greenland problem by cartographers. This is why people don't realize how enormous Africa is. Africa is the second largest continent after Asia, covering approximately 20% of the world's land area. Africa is about 25% larger than North America, and Africa is about 70% larger than South America. Let's compare it to another continent. Africa is almost 4 times the size of Australia. Why did the Europeans ignore colonizing this close, gigantic continent with all of its material resources, but spent centuries fighting over the Americas? It came down to germs. The unintentional germ warfare that Europeans brought to the Western Hemisphere gave the Europeans a distinct advantage in colonizing the Americas. But, in an ironic twist, the tables were turned in Africa. The Europeans were not the ones bringing diseases to obliterate the native populations. It was the other way around. African diseases were killing European explorers. The Europeans used to refer to the interior of Africa as the white man's grave. This was because local diseases, especially malaria, were just devastating to the Europeans. There were other local diseases in Africa like sleeping sickness, dengue fever, West Nile virus, and yellow fever, which killed entire European exploration teams. But malaria was by far the biggest killer. They had malaria in Europe, but the West African variety of malaria was much more aggressive and deadly. Starting with the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution in the mid to late 1700s, European countries began to lose their colonies in the Americas. By the mid-1800s, practically all of the Western Hemisphere had become independent from Europe. Yes, there were still exceptions like Cuba belonging to Spain, but the days of large colonial empires in the Americas were over. The problem was Europeans still liked having empires. If the Western Hemisphere was out, it was time to look to the Eastern Hemisphere. What about Asia and Oceania? The Dutch created an enormous colony called the Dutch East Indies. That was a collection of approximately 18,000 islands with great natural resources. That former colony is now known as the country of Indonesia. The French created the colony of French Indochina, consisting of the area which is now made up of the modern countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The British were the most successful in this part of the world. Starting in the late 1700s, the British acquired an entire continent, the modern country of Australia. The British also colonized New Zealand in the 1800s. And the British conquered huge populations in South Asia, which are now independent countries, including India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Singapore, and Myanmar. But what about Africa? At first, exploration led to outposts along the coast. In the 1400s, the Portuguese were exploring Africa. It wasn't just intellectual curiosity. The Portuguese were trying to find a way to Asia. Why? Europeans traded a lot with Asia. The trade went from Asia to the Middle East on the Silk Road. That is such a misnomer. It was not an actual road nor a single route. Once goods reached the Middle East, they were then moved on ships in the Mediterranean. Things changed in 1453. But first, I need to tell you a little background. In its later stages, the Roman Empire split into 2 parts. The Western Roman Empire was ruled from Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire was ruled from Constantinople. The Western Empire fell apart in the late 400s CE, but the Eastern Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years. They called themselves the Roman Empire, but we know them as the Byzantine Empire. In the later stages of its existence, the Byzantine Empire was being whittled down by the Ottoman Empire. By 1453, only the capital of Constantinople remained of the once mighty Byzantine Empire. But the capital finally fell when the Ottomans occupied the city on May 29, 1453. The Ottomans changed the name to Istanbul, which is known by today, in modern-day Turkey. The Ottomans essentially closed down Asian trade to Europe. Europeans still wanted goods from Asia, but they needed a new way to get those goods. The Portuguese were already exploring Africa decades before the fall of Constantinople. But the closing of the overland trail routes to Asia made finding a sailing passage to Asia critical. The Portuguese believed that there was a way to go around the southern part of Africa. Throughout the 1400s, they kept going further and further down the west coast of Africa. Finally, in 1488, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias became the first European to round the southern tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean. He didn't go all the way to India, he returned to Portugal. It was not until May of 1498 that Portuguese captain Vasco da Gama became the first European to reach India by sailing down around the southern part of Africa. How did Bartolomeu Dias know he was in the Indian Ocean in 1488? When the sun rose, he could tell which direction was east, and he could see that Africa was in the opposite direction, meaning it was to his west. This meant that he was now on the eastern side of Africa in the Indian Ocean. By the way, most people think that the Cape of Good Hope is Africa's southernmost point. It's not. Cabo das Agulhas is the southernmost location of Africa. The Cape of Good Hope is more famous than Cabo das Agulhas because the Cape of Good Hope is where ships stopped traveling south and started traveling eastward below Africa. Originally, Bartolomeu Dias named this point the Cape of Storms. The King of Portugal renamed it to the Cape of Good Hope to give it a more optimistic image. Although Portugal was the first European country to establish trading posts along the coast of Africa, other European nations soon followed. In the 1650s, the Dutch established a settlement at the Cape of Good Hope. It's now known as Cape Town, and it is an absolutely beautiful city. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British took over Cape Town from the Dutch, and, except for a couple of years, the British kept the Cape Colony until South Africa became an independent country. An interesting coastal settlement is Freetown. Today, Freetown is the capital and largest city of the country of Sierra Leone. In the late 1700s, Freetown was founded by the British as a place to resettle freed African Americans. During the American Revolutionary War, the British government promised any slaves that fought for the British that they would be freed after the war. The British kept their word. Some of the freed people were transferred to what became Canada, some to the West Indies, and some to England. In 1792, approximately 1,200 freed African Americans were sent to the modern country of Sierra Leone by the British government and founded Freetown. In the early 1800s, Freetown became a crown colony. In 1834, the British outlawed slavery throughout their enormous empire. When the Royal Navy captured any illegal slave ships, they would send the liberated Africans to Freetown. In 1961, Sierra Leone became an independent country. If you look on a map, directly southeast of Sierra Leone on the Atlantic coast of Africa is the country of Liberia. Liberia has a lot of ties to the United States. The flag of Liberia looks a lot like the American flag. However, instead of 13 alternating red and white stripes like the U.S. flag, there are 11 on the Liberian flag. That number was picked because there were 11 signatories of the Liberian Declaration of Independence. And in the upper left-hand corner, there is a blue field, but instead of 50 stars like the U.S. flag, the Liberian flag has one white five-pointed star. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia. It was originally called Christopolis. It was renamed Monrovia in 1824 after the fifth American president, James Monroe, who happened to be president at that time and was a supporter of the American Colonization Society and the colonization of Liberia. Liberia was founded in 1822. Liberia was a project of the American Colonization Society. That group was started in 1817 with the goal of sending free blacks to Africa. The entire colonization movement of sending freed black Americans to Africa was very divisive among both blacks and whites. There were some white people in the American Colonization Society who truly believed that blacks would never receive justice in the United States and would be better off in Africa. However, there was also a large percentage of white Americans who thought that slavery was evil and should not be tolerated, but they also did not want to have free blacks living among them and wanted to ship them off to Africa. There were blacks at that time who opposed any colonization in Africa. They were born in the United States. Why should they leave? There were also some free black Americans who thought that they would never receive equal rights in America and were willing to just quit the U.S. Liberia became an independent country in 1847 and has remained so ever since. Liberia proudly claims to be the oldest republic in Africa. I just referenced a few of the European coastal settlements in Africa. What changed and allowed the Europeans to go into the interior and conquer that enormous and very populous continent? There were medicinal and technological innovations that led to the colonization of the interior of Africa. Number one, the deadly African diseases were brought under a tolerable limit. At some point in the 1800s, people finally figured out that malaria was tied to mosquitoes. You could cut down on the amount of malaria by taking steps to cut the mosquito population. This meant getting rid of standing water in puddles and pools. But the big breakthrough came with the discovery and then the wide use of quinine. Quinine was very effective against malaria. Number two, technological breakthroughs. There were advances in transportation. Steamships could explore the limited number of navigable rivers, and more important, railroads. The use of railroads opened up large areas of the interior of Africa. There were also advances in military technologies. Since European diseases did not wipe out large percentages of the Africans like they did the Native Americans, there were much larger populations which needed to be physically conquered. In the 1800s, Europeans and Americans were developing advanced military weapons. Modern weaponry meant that small imperial armies could control much greater local populations. That's a very nice way of saying that it was much easier to slaughter large numbers of Africans or Asians. And for any of you in other countries listening to this episode and you want to yell at me and say, hey, what about the United States? Yes, these technological advantages were assisting in conquering the American West with devastating results to the Native American population. Not all Europeans who were investigating Africa were conquerors. There were many who were simply explorers, although most of that exploration led to later colonization. Probably the two most famous explorers would be Stanley and Livingstone. Those are names that most people have heard, but have no idea what either of those men did. We just know that they go together, Stanley and Livingstone. Let's start with David Livingstone. I've heard his name pronounced both Livingston and Livingstone, but I believe the correct pronunciation is Livingston, even though the name ends with an E. He was born on March 19, 1819 in Scotland. When he died in 1873, he was one of the most famous people on the planet. Livingstone was a medical doctor who became a missionary. He made several long expeditions to Africa. He first went to South Africa in 1841 to achieve two things. Number one, to spread Christianity. Number two, to undermine the slave trade. He stayed for the next 11 years, traveling to different locations on the continent of Africa and various islands. Contrary to what they show in the movies, these expeditions were not a lone white man finding his way through Africa. Livingstone had a lot of help from the local peoples who both guided him and translated for him. He also had the help of his wife. They even had children during this time in Africa. But in 1852, she returned to Britain with the children. From 1852 to 1856, Livingstone crossed the entire sub-Saharan continent. He first went to the Atlantic coast at the location of the modern city of Luanda, Angola. He then crossed all the way to the Indian Ocean to the location of the modern city of Quelimane, Mozambique. It was on this cross-continent trip that his guides took him to a waterfall locally known as Mosi Oa Tunya. That translates into English as the smoke that thunders. Livingstone became the first European to see this incredible waterfall. He named it Victoria Falls in honor of Queen Victoria of Britain, and that's what most Westerners call it today. Both names, Victoria Falls and Mosi Oa Tunya, are considered official today. I do not mean any disrespect to the local peoples, but I will refer to it as Victoria Falls because it is much easier for me to pronounce. Victoria Falls is very out of the way and kind of a pain in the neck to get to. However, it is absolutely worth it. It might be the most spectacular natural thing I have ever seen. According to the UNESCO website, Victoria Falls is the largest curtain of falling water in the world. There are 132 million gallons or 500 million liters of water descending per minute. It is 1.06 miles or 1.7 kilometers wide. To put that into perspective for us Americans and Canadians who have been to Niagara Falls, the three parts of Niagara Falls, called the American Falls, the Horseshoe Falls, and the Bridal Veil Falls, combined are 3,330 feet or 1,015 meters. That means that Victoria Falls is approximately 70% wider than all three parts of Niagara Falls put together. That is enormous. At its deepest drop, Victoria Falls plunges 354 feet or 118 meters. Again, to put that into perspective, the highest drop at Niagara Falls is 188 feet or 57 meters. And as I'm throwing out all of this information about waterfalls, I know you're dying to know, what is the tallest waterfall in the world? That would be Angel Falls in Venezuela, which drops 3,212 feet or 979 meters. That is 17 times as high as Niagara Falls. That is insane. Okay, that's enough of my love for waterfalls. Let's get back to David Livingstone. Although it is known that Arab and African traders had crossed the entire African continent, Livingstone was the first European to cross Africa from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. He returned to Britain in 1856 and was presented with the gold medal of the Royal Geographical Society. He wrote a book about his travels. His explorations and his book made Livingstone world famous. After 15 months in Britain, Livingstone set sail to return to Africa in March 1858. This expedition would last until July 1863. The goal was to explore the entire Zambezi River. Livingstone was very disappointed when he found the Cabora Bassa Rapids, which proved to be impassable. He had hoped that the Zambezi would be navigable from the Indian Ocean all the way to its headwaters. Livingstone traced the path of the entire Zambezi River. The Zambezi is approximately 1,700 miles or 2,700 kilometers long. I have traveled on a small part of the Zambezi River. It is absolutely beautiful. It's also incredibly dangerous with crocodiles and hippos. And no, I am not that brave. My family and I were completely safe in a large metal boat. But people in smaller boats sometimes get attacked by hippos. Although they look cute, a lot of humans die from hippos because people think that they are safe since hippos are herbivores and they look like they are slow. But hippos are very territorial and can move a lot faster than people think. Getting back to Livingstone. He returned to Britain from 1864 through 1865. Livingstone's final journeys in Africa were from 1866 until his death in 1873. During those 7 years, he explored most of East and Central Africa. These were areas which today include the countries of Mozambique, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In late April 1873, Livingstone died in a village which was located in present-day Zambia. Livingstone tried to determine what was the source of the Nile River. This was a complicated question. The Nile River is mainly formed by the conjunction of two tributaries called the Blue Nile and the White Nile. Those two tributaries meet in the city of Khartoum, the capital of the modern country of Sudan. The Blue Nile flows from Lake Tana in modern Ethiopia. Most of the expeditions in the 1800s focused on finding the source of the White Nile. In 1862, it was discovered by British explorer John Hanning Speke that the source of the White Nile was Lake Victoria. Speke is considered the first European to see Lake Lake Victoria. However, since other rivers flow into Lake Victoria, there's an ongoing argument as to what is the actual source of the White Nile. Now it's time to talk about the famous story of how Stanley found Livingstone. As I just told you, Dr. Livingstone returned to Africa in 1866. After that, nobody outside of Africa heard from him for years. There were rumors that he was dead. Nobody knew for sure. In October 1869, the publisher of the New York Herald newspaper, James Gordon Bennett, decided it would be a great story if he sent somebody to Africa to find David Livingstone. So Bennett sent Henry Morton Stanley to find Livingstone, or bring back all possible proofs of his being dead. I'll tell you about Stanley in a little bit. It took Stanley 2 years of searching Africa to find Livingstone. But on November 10, 1871, Stanley found Livingstone in modern-day Tanzania near Lake Tanganyika. That is when Stanley uttered the famous phrase that so many of us have heard. Dr. Livingstone, I presume? Stanley returned to the U.S. and published a book entitled How I Found Livingstone. The articles in the New York Herald and his book made Stanley world famous. But who was this guy? Henry Morton Stanley was born John Rowlands on January 28, 1841 in Wales. By 1859, he had changed his name to Henry Morton Stanley and moved to the United States. During the American Civil War, Stanley first fought for the Confederacy. Later, he joined the Union Army. How crazy is that? Really, how many people could there have been who were in both the Confederate and Union armies during the Civil War? As I outlined earlier, James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald paid for Stanley to find Livingstone. This made Stanley famous as an explorer. This brings us to Leopold II, the King of Belgium. I'll discuss him a lot more later. Leopold II really wanted an empire. He wanted to show that he was a big player on the world stage, and the best way to do that was to have an empire. He decided that the easiest place to colonize would be someplace in Africa. In 1879, he sponsored the famous Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo River basin with the goal of developing a Belgian colony. This was less than 50 years since Belgium had become an independent country, but Leopold II figured it was high time for an empire. As Stanley was mapping the Congo River area, the other European powers noticed, and they were not happy. All of Europe understood how valuable this area was. There were lots of valuable resources to be exploited, and all of the European powers wanted to cash in. King Leopold was worried about getting squeezed out by the major powers. So he talked to Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. Bismarck is the man who assembled the country of Germany out of many independent Germanic states in 1871. Bismarck was ruthless and a political genius. Supposedly, in the late 1890s, Bismarck was asked what was the most decisive fact in modern political history, and he is reputed to have said, "The fact that North Americans speak English." I've tried to verify this quote, but I've been unable to do so. It is cited a lot and always attributed to Otto von Bismarck, but I can never find when he supposedly said it or to whom. I like to think that he actually said it because it shows incredible insight just before the 20th century. The common language between the greatest empire at the time, Britain, and the rising industrial and military giant of the United States foretold of the special relationship. And added to that was Canada with all of its resources. And yes, I'm aware that the province of Quebec speaks French, but most of Canada speaks English. Now it's time to talk about the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The conference was hosted by Otto von Bismarck. This was a truly remarkable meeting. The European powers got together in Berlin to decide how to partition Africa. Of course, no Africans were invited to the conference. Think of the impudence of these European leaders. The thought process was, hey, we all want a piece of Africa, but we don't want to have to fight each other for these African colonies. Before the Berlin Conference, European countries controlled approximately 20% of the African continent, and those colonies were all located along the coasts. The largest colonies at that time included, number one, the Cape Colony, which would later become the country of South Africa, that was a British colony. Number 2, Algeria, which was a French colony. Number 3, the 2 large Portuguese colonies, which are the modern countries of Angola and Mozambique. The Berlin Conference started on November 15, 1884, and ended on February 26, 1885. The countries that participated in the Berlin Conference were Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Russia, Italy, the Netherlands, Denmark, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, Sweden, Norway, and the United States. You might have noticed that I said Austria-Hungary together and Sweden-Norway together like they were joint countries. That's because they were. From 1814 to 1905, Norway and Sweden joined together under a common monarch and common foreign policy. And the Habsburg Empire of Austria became known as Austria-Hungary in 1867 and kept that name until the empire was dissolved at the end of World War I. Why was the United States at the Berlin Conference? The U.S. was not seeking any colonies in Africa. The U.S. wanted to protect its perceived commercial interests, mainly free trade in Africa. The U.S. Senate never ratified the treaty from the Berlin Conference. And some of the other countries that were at the Berlin Conference did not get any colonies in Africa. Those were Russia, the Netherlands, Denmark, Turkey, Austria-Hungary, and Sweden-Norway. They were just monitoring the situation, kind of like the U.S. was doing. Contrary to popular belief, the Berlin Conference did not carve up Africa as individual colonies for the various signatory nations. There's a famous political cartoon from that time showing Africa as a large cake with Otto von Bismarck slicing it up into pieces for all of the European nations. But that's not how it went. They did not draw lines on a map and partition the continent. The parties agreed to a written agreement called the General Act of the Berlin Conference on West Africa, 26 February 1885. I've read that agreement signed by the representatives of the 14 countries at the conference. It's not that long. Here are the main points reached in that agreement. Number 1, the trade of all nations shall enjoy complete freedom in all the regions forming the basin of the Congo and its outlets, and all signatory nations shall have free navigation of the Congo and its branches and outlets. This turned out to be a farce, as I'll explain later. Number 2, Chapter 2, Article 9 outlawed the slave trade. This was certainly the best thing that came out of the Berlin Conference. By 1885, slavery had been abolished in most places. As I told you earlier, Britain outlawed slavery in 1834, not only in the United Kingdom, but throughout the British Empire. And famously, by 1865, slavery had been abolished in the United States as a result of the American Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, and the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. However, by the end of the Berlin Conference in 1885, slavery was still legal in the enormous country of Brazil. Brazil did not officially outlaw slavery until May 13, 1888. Brazil became the last nation in the Western Hemisphere to officially abolish slavery. The number 3 result of the General Act of the Berlin Conference, Chapter 5 of the agreement provides for the free navigation of the Niger River. And number 4, regulations for further colonization of Africa. These were very general guidelines set forth in Chapter 6 of the agreement. The key provision is found in Article 34, which essentially states that any of the signatory countries which, going forward, took possession of a part of Africa as a colony had to notify the other European countries to see if any other European country already had a claim to that area. But after the Berlin Conference, Europeans followed 3 basic rules for all further colonization of Africa. Number 1, effective occupation. A European power could not simply claim an area of Africa as its own. That European country had to actually occupy that particular region of Africa. An occupation meant that the particular European nation established an administration of the territory and had the military forces to implement its rules. Number 2, If a European power claimed a part of Africa, it would have to notify the other European countries. The purpose of this was to see if any other European country was asserting a claim to that same area. Again, you have to remember that one of the main reasons for the Berlin Conference was to avoid any conflicts between the Europeans. Number 3, the Europeans would have to sign a treaty with the local people to allow the Europeans to colonize the area. Of course, this was always a farce. The Europeans would designate an African as the leader of the area and have him sign a treaty. Certainly, the Africans had no idea what they were signing. And by this, I do not imply any lack of intelligence. I'm just pointing out, if some strange people who did not speak your language asked you to sign a piece of paper which was written in a foreign language that you did not understand, do you really think it's a binding treaty? And often the person signing the treaty on behalf of the Africans was not really in charge of that region. The Europeans just needed anybody to sign. And sometimes these signatures were obtained with bribes or threats. The Berlin Conference sent the Scramble for Africa into high gear. Prior to the Berlin Conference, only 20% of Africa had been colonized by Europeans. In less than 30 years, by the start of World War I in 1914, over 90% of Africa had been colonized by the Europeans. The only two countries that remained independent were Liberia and Abyssinia. 15 years before the start of the Berlin Conference, the Suez Canal formally opened on November 17, 1869. It was built by a company headed by a Frenchman named Ferdinand de Lesseps. The opening of the Suez Canal made the east coast of Africa a lot more accessible to Europeans. Instead of having to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa, Europeans could go through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, and then the Red Sea to get to the east coast of Africa. This route was much shorter and made colonies in the eastern part of Africa more valuable. The colonization of Africa led to many long-term problems for the people of Africa. One of the harmful results of the scramble was the creation of artificial countries. In the centuries before the Europeans arrived, Africa had kingdoms, empires, tribes, and various civilizations. But after the Scramble for Africa by World War I, the continent had been divided into many countries/colonies. There were approximately 50 countries/colonies. I say approximately because some borders were kind of fluid. Some huge areas were kind of lumped together like French West Africa, but sometimes they were treated as separate colonies within the giant territory of French West Africa. The problem was the borders of these new countries/colonies were created by the Europeans and had nothing to do with the local peoples. In most of Europe and Asia, the borders of countries reflect a particular ethnic group. Take France, for example. Most of the people in France speak French, a lot share the same religions, and most share a common cultural background or descent. But that's not what happened with the Scramble for Africa. The countries divided up over 1,000 indigenous cultures and regions of Africa. Groups of peoples who had nothing in common were suddenly part of the same country. And coherent groups of peoples were often divided between two or more countries. These artificially created countries exist today. The fact that these borders were drawn up by the Europeans to satisfy their own disputes with no rhyme or reason for the indigenous peoples is one reason why so much of Africa is dysfunctional today. Here's an example of an oddly created country. The British were controlling the Gambia River and made that area into a colony. It's now the modern country of the Gambia. Except for a small coastal region on the Atlantic, the French had that British colony completely surrounded. The French tried to acquire the area along the Gambia River from Britain in exchange for other territories, but the British refused. That is why today, the country of Senegal, which had been a French colony, surrounds the tiny country of the Gambia on three sides. The fourth side is the Atlantic Ocean. Look at a map, and it's insane that this is a separate country. The country is approximately 300 miles or around 480 kilometers long from west to east. but it's only about 15 to 30 miles or 25 to 50 kilometers wide north to south. It's crazy that a country has those dimensions. It only became a country because the British kept it as one of their many colonial possessions in Africa. A few moments ago, I mentioned Senegal. That country is the answer to a trivia question: what is the westernmost country, excluding islands, in the Eastern Hemisphere? And the answer is Senegal. And I know that there are people out there who like to argue that the division between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere is the prime meridian of Greenwich, England, which would make Senegal in the Western Hemisphere. But I go by the common definition that the Western Hemisphere comprises the Americas and the Eastern Hemisphere comprises all of Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania, meaning Australia, New Zealand, that part of the world. Getting back to the artificial borders created by Europeans. The borders which divide indigenous groups and lump diverse peoples together have caused conflicts over the years. Splitting up ethnic groups into two or more countries has led to civil wars, discrimination, and instability in those modern countries. Life was hard for all Africans during the time of European colonization, but some colonies suffered more than others, and the colony that suffered the most was the Congo. First of all, did you ever wonder why it's called the Congo instead of just Congo? Egypt is just called Egypt, not the Egypt. The same for Algeria, Nigeria, South Africa. The general rule is that for country names, we only use the definite article the in two circumstances. Number one, the country's name includes a common noun. For example, the United States of America has the common noun states in it, so we use the. Some other examples: the Central African Republic, the Czech Republic. Number two, we use the if the country is an island country, like the Philippines or the Bahamas. Although it was never the official name of the country, why did people call this region the Congo instead of just Congo? It's because the area was named after a river. And when discussing a river, we always use the article the, like the Nile, the Mississippi, or the Danube. The Congo is kind of like that borough of New York City, the Bronx. The name derived from a river. New York City is very large geographically as well as by population. The city of New York is comprised of 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Queens, and the Bronx. And here's a unique thing about New York City. Although those 5 boroughs comprise one city, each borough is considered a separate county in the government of the state of New York. The names of the counties are slightly different. Manhattan is New York County, Brooklyn is Kings County, Staten Island is Richmond County, but Queens is simply Queens County, and the Bronx is Bronx County without the in front of the name. It's simply Bronx County, not the Bronx County. So why is the borough called the Bronx? In the 1600s, a man named Jonas Bronck owned that land. His name was spelled B-R-O-N-C-K. The river that went through that area became known as the Bronx River. For some reason, the spelling got changed to B-R-O-N-X, and people just started calling the area around the river the Bronx. Okay, after that crazy detour I just took, let's discuss the true name of the country of the Congo. Actually, there are 2 countries named after the Congo River. The first is the enormous country that was the Belgian colony, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The second is next door and is much smaller. It was a French colony and it's currently called the Republic of the Congo. Those 2 names are ridiculously close: the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the Republic of the Congo. I don't know why they chose such similar names. Kinshasa is the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the former Belgian colony, and Brazzaville is the capital of the Republic of the Congo, the former French colony. To avoid confusion of the almost identical names, people inside and outside of those countries often refer to them by their capital cities. People refer to Congo Kinshasa or Congo Brazzaville. And not to confuse you further, but for some reason, when they refer to the country by using their capital, they don't use the. They just say Congo Kinshasa or Congo Brazzaville. But in colonial times, it was always called the Congo. Fun fact: Kinshasa and Brazzaville are the closest national capitals in the world. They are located on opposite sides of the Congo River and are only approximately 1 mile or 1.6 kilometers apart. Both countries have large French-speaking populations since Congo-Brazzaville was a French colony and Congo-Kinshasa was a Belgian colony, and a large percentage of people in Belgium speak French. And here's another fun fact. Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, surpasses Paris as the most populated French-speaking city in the world. Yes, this was a special episode where you got 2 fun facts. The Congo River is huge. It is the Earth's second largest river by volume, draining an area of 1.4 million square miles or 3.7 million square kilometers. That area is known as the Congo Basin. It's the world's second largest tropical forest. To put that into perspective, the Congo Basin is larger than the state of Alaska. The Congo Basin is almost half as large as the continent of Australia. As I told you earlier, one of the driving forces in the Scramble for Africa was King Leopold II of Belgium. This guy really wanted to be seen as a major player on the world stage, and he thought that the way to do that was to have 1 or more colonies. At the time, Belgium was not a major power. When the Berlin Conference started, Belgium had only existed for 54 years. In 1830, Belgium became an independent country. Leopold II had a lot of arrogance, yet the other European powers eventually agreed that King Leopold could have as his personal domain the Congo Basin. That is now the country known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Congo-Kinshasa. Leopold's colony of the Congo was almost 80 times larger than the country of Belgium. And here's the craziest part. All of the other colonies carved out of Africa belonged to a European country. The Cape Colony belonged to Britain. Angola and Mozambique belonged to Portugal. But the Congo was considered the personal property of King Leopold II. It was not a colony of the country of Belgium. So how did King Leopold get the other European powers to agree that he could have the Congo Basin? It was mostly because the major powers of Britain, France, and Germany did not trust each other with such an enormous and valuable colony. And the thought was it was better to have a small and relatively weak country like Belgium in charge than one of the other major powers. As I explained earlier, the French did have a smaller colony on the western part of the Congo. King Leopold II established the Congo Free State in 1885. I love that name, the Congo Free State. Talk about a misnomer. This was not a free state by any stretch of the imagination. First of all, the Congo Free State was the personal possession of Belgian King Leopold II. This meant that the Congo was not a colony administered by the country of Belgium. Leopold privately owned the Congo. And other countries recognized the Congo as Leopold's exclusive property. But Leopold named it the Congo Free State because of the agreements made at the Berlin Conference that the Congo would be open to trade, meaning exploitation, by all countries. But that was just the name. The Congo Free State was Leopold's property, and he exploited its resources and kept the money. Officially, Leopold's stated goal was to bring civilization to the people of the Congo. The theory of bringing civilization to other countries was often used as an excuse by more powerful peoples to colonize and exploit weaker peoples. And think about the hubris of that attitude of our society is civilized and yours is not. So let's see how Leopold brought civilization, and I'm putting civilization in heavy quotes, to the people of the Congo. Leopold wanted to enrich himself personally. He was not interested in the wealth of Belgium as a country. The riches were all going to Leopold privately. The Congo Basin had incredible natural resources. Those included palm oil, which was widely used at the time, as well as ivory. And when I say ivory, that means the tusks of elephants. Countless elephants were slaughtered simply to obtain their ivory tusks. But the most valuable resource in the Congo was rubber. Natural rubber is made by extracting the liquid sap called latex from certain types of trees and vines. In the Congo, rubber was mostly found in vines. The Congolese natives were forced to work harvesting rubber, palm oil, and ivory, and I mean forced. Anybody who did not meet their quotas were physically beaten, and even worse, many had their hands cut off. Yeah, you heard me. A lot of the atrocities were executed by the force publique. That's French for the public force. They were African soldiers led by European officers employed by King Leopold. The force publique would cut off the hand of someone who did not meet their quota of harvesting rubber or palm oil. And this included men, women, and even children if their quotas were not met. Sometimes the force publique would hold women and children hostage and would not release them until their male relatives brought in the required amounts of rubber or other raw materials. And remember, Leopold's stated goal was to bring civilization to the Congolese. Instead, Leopold brought true barbarism to the Congo. The terrible exploitation in the Congo was the subject of the famous novella Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. That was first published in serial form in 1899 and as a book in 1902. As a result of the attention of the deplorable conditions in the Congo raised by Heart of Darkness, as well as by newspaper articles, particularly by British journalist Edmund Dean Morel, pressure mounted against Leopold II. Finally, in 1908, the Belgian government took control of the Congo Free State from Leopold and renamed it the Belgian Congo. It was now a colony of Belgium instead of the private property of the king. 1 year later, Leopold died in 1909. By the time World War I started in 1914, the only two countries in Africa that were truly independent were Liberia and Abyssinia. Britain and France controlled most of the continent. Britain was in control from Egypt in the northeast down most of the eastern part of the continent to South Africa, as well as Nigeria and some smaller colonies along the Atlantic coast. France controlled most of the northwest part of the continent. As we discussed, the enormous Congo was a Belgian colony. Portugal had several colonies. The two largest are now the countries of Angola and Mozambique. Before World War I, Germany had several colonies in Africa and elsewhere. In Africa, Germany had colonies which are now the current countries of Tanzania, Namibia, Cameroon, Burundi, Rwanda, and Togo. Before World War I, Italy had colonies which are now the countries of Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. And lastly, Spain controlled a small part of the northwest coastal parts of Africa and the modern country of Equatorial Guinea. After World War I, Germany lost its African colonies. The big changes to colonial Africa came after World War II. Italy lost their colonies because they were a defeated country. Britain and France were both on the winning side of World War II, but neither was a world power anymore. France's time as a world power ended in June 1940 when they were overrun by Germany. And even though Britain was one of the big three allies who won the war with the US and the Soviet Union, Britain was broke. Britain and France controlled most of Africa in 1945, but neither had the power to keep their colonies. Independence movements spread throughout Africa as well as Asia. By the end of the 1960s, most colonies in Africa gained their independence. Even the Congo-Kinshasa gained its independence from Belgium in 1960. Amazingly, tiny Portugal held onto its African colonies until the disco era in 1975. One of the terrible legacies of the colonization of Africa was apartheid in the country of South Africa. The name apartheid means apartness in the Afrikaans language. Of course, you're now wondering, what is Afrikaans? It's one of the official languages of South Africa. It's derived from the Dutch language when the Dutch founded the colony around the Cape of Good Hope. Apartheid became the law in South Africa in 1948. This was after World War II. It did not end until the early 1990s. It was a legalized system of segregation. Everybody was designated into a racial group from white to black. In between those two extremes were Asians, meaning people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, and a group of mixed race people, which were referred to as coloreds. And if you're thinking that sounds like an offensive term, yes, it was and is. The apartheid system was installed to keep whites in charge. When apartheid was implemented in 1948, whites were approximately 20% of the population of South Africa. By the end of apartheid in the early 1990s, whites were only 13% of the population. There had always been segregation in South Africa, but under the apartheid system, it was strictly regulated. Under apartheid, the races were separated as to where they could live, what jobs they could hold, what education they could receive. And, as you could probably guess, mixed marriages were illegal. I only bring up the apartheid system to show one of the remnants of European colonization of Africa. If Europeans did not colonize South Africa, there never would have been an apartheid system. And in case anybody in South Africa is listening to this episode and you want to yell at me about throwing stones while living in a glass house, yes, of course, I am aware of the Jim Crow laws in the United States which discriminated against blacks for decades. There are plenty of remnants of the Scramble for Africa. According to the U.S. Library of Congress website, Africa is home to nearly 2,000 languages, mostly indigenous. But because of colonial times, European languages are widely used. Although probably not an exhaustive list, French is currently spoken in these African countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, Comoros, the Democratic Republic of Congo, meaning Congo-Kinshasa, the Republic of Congo, meaning Congo-Brazzaville, the Côte d'Ivoire, aka the Ivory Coast, Djibouti, Gabon, Guinea, Madagascar, Mali, Niger, Rwanda, Senegal, the Seychelles, Mauritania, Mauritius, and Togo. Many of the largest Francophone cities are in the African countries. Today, English is one of the primary languages used in these countries: Nigeria, Liberia, Ghana, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Reviews really help. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, hopefully 5 stars, and then tap Write a Review. If you're listening on Spotify or any other podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for history geeks. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.